Greetings all, welcome to the, I don't even know what number this is, October 2020 Q&A. I have had an interesting couple of weeks, which is why I'm doing this a little bit low key. So ordinarily it takes me maybe 2 days of research and writing a day to record and a day to edit. And frankly, I just haven't had that time. Well, I say day, I mean evenings, because I have a day job and an army weekend job and whatever else. Plus, because basically you don't get promoted to colonel unless you get a master's degree, I decided I'm going to start a master's degree. Now, when I was in college, I'm not going to say it was a mistake, but I made the common decision to choose a degree that I thought I might be at least vaguely interested in, but that would be good for me in my career. As I've gotten older, I've realized that this may not have been the right move, so I've decided that for a master's I'm going to do something that I actually have an interest in. The army doesn't seem to care. I mean, the degree could be in the history of Japanese art for all the army cares, I think. They just wanted me to check that I have a postgrad degree. So I decided that since I seem to be doing this for a living anyway, I might as well get some sort of qualification. So I started a master's with military history, World War II. And my God, they had me reading Hageman, the American Civil War and the Origins of Modern Warfare. It doesn't do that. It's an incredible book. It's very well researched. But by God, if you're not actually interested very much in the American Civil War, and frankly I amn't, this is incredibly painful. Highly recommend it, but by God, it takes up your time. So that murdered that. What else has been going on? I don't think it was out at the time I did my last Q&A, but I did the 2-hour chat with Harry Yidey for the Tank Killers. And if this video goes out on schedule, in a couple of days on the 29th of October, I'm doing another 2-hour chat with Harry Yidey, except on the book The Infantry's Armour, which is the story of the independent tank battalions in World War II. The previous video, if you missed it, is up on the World of Tanks channel, and as will be the second one with Harry, which is going to be a live event. So if you are able to come in on time on the 29th at 6 p.m. Central, you can ask us questions and ask the author of the book. So I like to do things a bit differently than your typical book club. What else? Also, if this is going according to plan, as you are watching this, I am outside of the state of Texas for the first time since February, I believe it is, and I'm recording a vehicle for Inside the Hatch. So hopefully that will come out soon enough. Anything else? 2-year-old is still driving me nuts. Poor wife's had it. Okay, so I'm going to be taking a leaf out of Ian's book, and I'm going to be doing this on the fly because I haven't had the time to do the research. So I have a fine example of single malt Irish apple juice, and I'm just going to take this as it comes. So I'm going to kick off with a couple of questions that were posted in the last Q&A video. So as ever, the priority does go to the patrons. But if somebody throws me a good question on Facebook or YouTube or whatever, I'll throw it onto the list and answer it as best I can. So I'm going to start off with Thiago Perotto Zoccoli. How does tank aiming account for the Coriolis effect on targets at a distance? It doesn't. Even if you're shooting indirect, I don't think anybody cares. Artillery, yes, I believe that they take into account, and I'm told that snipers might, although I'm not sure why. But considering the velocity of a tank round, no, it doesn't seem to be an issue. Certainly, I don't believe, we're not taught about it, and I've never seen any reference to it in the fire control manuals. Wanderer RTF. How do you view gun mortar systems in modern use? Light weapon systems suitable to be mounted in IFV. Way back in the day, the very first armored vehicle somebody tried to train me on was the AML-60, which had the 60mm gun mortar, so it could be the breech loader, or you drop it down the top. You literally step outside the vehicle and you drop the bomb down the far end of the muzzle of the gun for indirect fire, but it could be used in the direct fire mode as well. Including the option to use guided munitions like Sturks. Are such systems useful, or do you think mortar should stay separate from direct fire, such as the Swedish chose with the Mjolnir mortar system? So reference systems like Amos, Nemo, or M120. They seem like good systems for bringing plenty of bang for the buck. Add Nona and Vena to the mix. I personally don't think that mortars should be in the direct fire role. I mean, I can understand kind of what you're talking about if you got a really light unit that doesn't have anything bigger than, let's say, an 84mm recoilless rifle for blowing things up. But generally speaking, I think you're probably better off, if you're going to have a self-propelled artillery system, use it in the indirect role. You'd probably want a fairly poorly equipped infantry unit if you really need to have the 120 mortar brought up in the direct fire role. I mean, I'm not saying that it can't be done or is not useful. Certainly, especially back in the 60s and 70s, this was a big thing. Again, the ML60 or the 2S9. I don't think direct fire systems are really the way to go on this. And if the Swedish, he says, chose indirect only, apparently the Swedish agree with me, so I'm in good company. I mentioned in the video that with the conversion of the last cavalry unit to strikers, the core capability was lost. COPR, by the way. Copper? CORPS. Makes me wonder, what is it that armored cavalry units that mech or tank infantry cannot? What is the core capability that they used to provide? So an ACR was the cavalry unit assigned to a corps level formation. Armored Cavalry Regiment. And cavalry in the US has a different role to cavalry in most other countries. And when I say cavalry, I don't mean tankers pretending to be cavalry, such as in the British Army, or indeed tankers pretending to be cavalry in the US Army today, since they just simply reflagged everything that whatever it was, infantry, armor, cavalry, and they all making the same unit regardless. I speak of cavalry in this case as actually this is their function and their table of equipment. So usually the units tasked with reconnaissance in other armies, particularly Europeans, that is their sole function. They get small little vehicles, maybe a couple of machine guns or something for self-defense, a 30mm at the better end. And if they happen to come across a light armored vehicle on the opposite side, sure, they'll take a crack at it. But otherwise, really, it's just sneaking and peeking, and that's the end of it. It's reconnaissance. American cavalry does more. It does reconnaissance, it does security, and economy of force missions. So, and a cavalry unit, of course, has a lot fewer dismounts. There are no infantry to play around. You just got a couple of guys in the back, or your Bradley, or Humvee, or whatever it is, Striker. The reconnaissance mission is as you would expect. So guys on Humvees with LRASs, or just somebody gets out of the back of the Bradley and climbs over the hill with a pair of binoculars and a radio. Your typical reconnaissance duties. It is a little harder to do a sneak and peek if you're 12 feet tall, as the movie said, but you could do it. The security missions are particularly guard, screen, and cover. Actually, technically, it should be said screen, guard, and cover. Screen is, well, again, pretty much anything can do a screen because you're sitting there with a radio. It's basically reconnaissance in reverse. You're keeping an eye out for where the enemy are, and you're providing warning time for other assets to deal with the problem. A guard mission is a little bit heavier, and you are expecting to maybe fight a delaying action to give your friends time to redeploy. This is something that you want to have a fair bit of firepower to do. And a cover mission is basically you are holding the line, you're providing security for another unit, you're fighting pretty much independently, self-contained. And the idea is that by use of your cavalry regiment, you don't have to divert the main combat line units to deal with whatever it is that's coming at them from the side. You have the cavalry for that. So the old ACRs, they were 3 squadrons or battalion-sized organizations of Bradleys or tanks. They had a helicopter asset. They had their own artillery. In fact, they had a lot of artillery. Every battalion had its own battery, and every company had a couple of mortars. So there's plenty of indirect going around. They had a lot of logistical support for independent operations. They had larger allocation of fuel tankers, of tank transporters. They had heavy equipment transporters than a regular unit. There is a paper, I'll see if I can find it, I'll put a link down the bottom, that basically discusses the ACR and what the asset is that the Army is losing when this was written maybe 10 years ago, maybe more at this point, by the deactivation of the ACR. So that is basically a difference between what an Armored Cavalry Regiment does versus anything else. Now, with the absence of a cavalry regiment, what can you use to replace it? And really, it's a brigade combat team is the closest thing you're going to get. And it's not ideally suited for it, and it's not designed for the role, but that's what the Army has, so that's what we get to play with. Next question. Oh, evil twin. Cavalry units in US ABCTs, Armored Brigade Combat Teams, are currently moving from 3 Bradleys and 5 Humvees and 36 soldiers to 6 Bradleys, 36 soldiers in the platoons. Why is the change being implemented, and what are the advantages and disadvantages? Do I have a preference? Now, when I was a CO, I had the Humvee Bradley mix. And there were a couple of debates as to how best to organize it. As I recall, doctrinally, you were supposed to have the Humvee and Bradley in pairs, mismatched pairs. So the Humvee will go out front while the Bradley would cover. And those would be the sections inside the platoon. The alternative organization is you have a Humvee section and a Bradley section. And you would send the Humvees where the Humvees could go, and you could send the Bradleys where the Humvees couldn't go, or vice versa. And the downside, though, was when the Humvees got into trouble, they didn't have the Bradleys to cover them so easily. And then again, if you've only got one Bradley covering one Humvee, there's only so much firepower that one Bradley is giving. So again, what are you getting, what are you losing? Of course, there was the 2 mortars as well that the company has available, so hopefully even if it's just that one Humvee and one Bradley, your mortars will be able to cover. But the bottom line is that you're getting the worst of both worlds if you're mixing vehicle types, because there will be bridges that the Humvee can cross and the Bradley can't. Or there will be soft ground that the Bradley can cross and the Humvee can't. Or there will be... You get the idea. You're limited both ways by both the wheel capability and the track capability. By going to a vehicle pure unit, you no longer have that issue of having both Bradleys and Humvees. Now, the other interesting little item is that the M3 CFV, the cavalry fighting vehicle, the Bradley basically, that has very few seats in the back, and it has room for more missiles and 25mm ammunition. Remember, cavalry are supposed to fight in the US. On the other hand, that also meant that in your platoon, you tended not to have spare seats for an additional signals guy or a JTAC, tactical air controller, or forward observer, or an interpreter. Heaven forbid you might need an interpreter in the back of your Bradley. I guess they weren't thinking about, counterinsurgency when they were designing the Bradley. So there has been a move to take the M3s away and replace them with M2s with less of a missile load, but you got more room for dismounts in the back. So that is basically the gist of why it's being done. It increases the firepower of the platoon, again for the engagement requirement. In addition to that, they also brought back a tank company. So it used to be just Bradleys and Humvees back in my day. See, it's grey here. Whereas now they have the 3 recon platoons and a tank company. I remember being brought aside one day by first sergeant of the company, the tank company. Oh, what's your opinions on how you use these things? Because the manual, apparently at the time, at least 3 years ago, didn't really specify how the tanks were supposed to be used. And it's a case of, well, does anybody still have the old manuals? And apparently almost all the old manuals are gone. There might be somebody in the back cupboards at NTC, perhaps, that has the old maneuver manuals that you'd have to drag down and see if you've got some grizzled old CW5 who remembers once being perhaps a corporal in back in the M60 DivCav days or something. So anyway, that's what happened. The tanks were added because the cavalry formations with the Bradleys simply didn't have the capability to do the 3 security missions. They could not do a cover. Doctrinally they were supposed to, but everybody realized that in practice they could not do so unless augmented by units from the line battalions, which of course reduces the strength of the line battalions. So that's why they got extra tanks. Also, how was the M17? Was it as fun to shoot? It's a pistol. I mean, I like SIGs, I really do. But I didn't have any objections, particularly to the Beretta either, the M9. And as combat pistols, a combat pistol, really. I mean, it's kind of like the Army's pistol qualification range. You can take the rounds out of the magazine, throw them at the target, and you'll probably still pass. So it works. The bullets went where I told them to go, and I don't know, M17, there you go. I have no complaints, best I can say. Metal Master, greetings from Germany. Have a little question. Recently had a discussion on the new Leopard 2 A7V video from the Bundeswehr channel about ammo storage. Should the Leopard delete his ammo storage in the hull and put it into the turret like the M1? He argued it's better because of blowout panels and it's dangerous to have ammo in the hull, which could start a significant emotional event when hit. I don't know if there are blowout panels for the hull stowage or not. It could very well be that the security is supposed to be because it's in the hull and not up high. Now certainly there's a blowout, there's an ammo door and blowout panel in the bustle stowage, but it's only, what, 15 rounds? There was a video going around recently, I don't know if you've seen it, of an Austrian loader just slinging rounds into a simulator. Well, yeah, that's great, you can do it, but that would be an instant no-go in the US Army, because you're supposed to have the ammunition door closed when you pull the trigger, just in case there's an incident and there's a fire or something. So as I understand it, with the Leopard being perhaps a little bit more cramped than the M1, the radio is behind the TC, if I recall correctly. So you don't have the option of putting the extra ammunition back there. I'm not sure what else is behind the TC, honestly. I never really looked. And the ammo's got to go somewhere. So if there's blowout panels down there, fantastic. If not, don't get hit. Alright, so now on to the various patrons. In my last Q&A I mentioned how European and American conceptions of firearms and firearms ownership are different. Since I lived in both cultures pretty extensively, would I expand on what those differences are? Fundamentally, the main difference is in Europe, in most countries, I mean, there are exceptions, maybe, like the Czechs, for example, would have one. In most countries, it's a case of you have to apply for permission to have a firearm and explain why you should have one. Whereas in the US, you don't. In the US, it's up to the government to explain why you shouldn't have one. And I grew up obviously with the European mindset of, only police and military should have guns. And in fact, in Ireland, even the police didn't really have many firearms. They still don't. You don't see them openly worn. They're out there, don't worry, but your average Bobby on the beat isn't going to be wearing one. And so when I came over to the US, it was a bit of a culture shock to think that I could actually own a pistol. And it's one of those things that after living here for a while and researching and seeing how things work, it's horses for courses. It really does. I think the American system works well for the American situation. And you can't go to Ireland and say, yeah, our system is better. I mean, you can make moral arguments perhaps. Oh, we have the right to self-defense, but you don't have the right to actually have the tools to do it. But the other thing, though, is that it's a lot more underground. There are, I think, how many firearms? It's like 400,000 firearms in Ireland in a population of 5 million. And people don't realize that. They think Ireland is a gun-free zone, basically. And yeah, sure, most of them are shotguns or 22s, but still, they'll kill you dead. And the same for the other countries around Europe. It's almost like it's an underground culture. And the other thing about it is you go to a firearm shop in some place like Germany, and it's kind of like, it's like a boutique shop. Whereas, you go to, I remember, what was it in Owensboro, Kentucky? It was like the largest gun store in Kentucky. And it was relatively dingy. It was in Owensboro. Yeah, it was Owensboro. A relatively dingy sort of building, but by God, there's firearms all over the place. Anything you wanted, more or less, you could have. And then, of course, those videos you get from Rock Island Arsenal, Rock Island Auction Company that Ian will do, and it's kind of just rows and rows of firearms. It's amazing. But yeah, it's different. So even in the US, I used to live in California, and now I live in Texas. Well, California, you have one set of rules, and in Texas, I wear a sidearm when I go outside the door. So, a few exceptions, but generally speaking. So, that is your answer, Matt. And I'm now going to get Gun of the Month out of the way, because I didn't have one last month. And it's big. This may look like an FAL. It's not. Because remember, I used to live in California until very recently. This is an SA-58 because FALs are illegal. It actually is an FAL, but it says on the side it is an SA-58. I got it as a parts kit. I believe it was formerly a South African R1. And it came to me in something like 60 individual pieces, everything except the upper body. And I did not have a manual on how to put it together. Fortunately, this was my service weapon in the Irish Army. So I actually had a vague idea what the thing was supposed to look like put together to include inside the body. With the, we call it the rat tail. I don't know what you guys call it in America. And the breech block and slide, which I guess in American you'll call the bolt and carrier. It's interesting how you get different names for exactly the same thing. Of course, in California, I had to make a couple of other tweaks. I had a top-loading thing with a fixed magazine. Other things that it came with, they never taught us how to use it, I don't think. The Energa sight for the rifle grenade, never saw one in my career. But it sort of flips up, and the way you're supposed to do it is you aim the body of the grenade, forms basically the front sight post, and then you aim off the rear sight post here on the grenade. A nice feature, and I don't know why other rifles tend not to do it, is the dial for the gas setting. So what you do is you initially set the gas setting fairly high, so there's a lot of recoil. You fire around, and then you keep lowering the gas setting a little bit until it no longer cycles the round, which is the lowest possible gas setting that you can have, -1. So you kick it back up a notch, so it's low enough recoil to be comfortable, because 7.62, it's a big enough round, and still it will reliably cycle. And if things do go all haywire and wonky, you can adjust the gas setting anyway. This was one of those rifles that gave me the feeling of absolute solidity. I mean, no matter what I did with it, and it still feels this way, no matter what I do with it, it will work. It's like AK reputation, as it were. So the right arm of the free world, as they call it, the FAL, or sorry, SA-58. Another interesting distinction, actually, I've noticed between the Americans and Irish. So, for example, it is generally considered bad form. Oh, get in there, you little bugger. I don't take this apart often enough, obviously. It's considered bad form in the US to look down the end of the barrel. Well, when we were doing inspections and the inspecting officer is looking to check, is your rifle barrel clean, for example, instead of going through the hassle of breaking it open and looking it down, charge it open, lock the breech block and slide to the rear, place your thumbnail in here, and if you get it right, the light will reflect off your thumbnail up the barrel, and the inspecting officer can then just look down the barrel and see the rifling and the inside of the barrel from the light reflected off your thumb. And I have seen pictures of this happening, and American gun sites are mocking it. I said, look, you've just charged the thing to the rear. The officer has watched you do it. He sees that you have your finger in the thumb, in the slot. It's probably safe to inspect. So that was gun of the month. This is part of my my quest to get a rifle or a firearm of everything that the Irish Army ever used. And you will be seeing this again in a future video if all goes well, because I have something special planned for it, which got cancelled by COVID, unfortunately. Well, postponed is a better term. Skino gaming. Why don't coaxial cannon machine guns such as the 12-7 or 20mm show up all that often? And why were they on tanks such as the MX-30? All right, so if you look at the M47 patent, the mount for the coaxial could mount either the caliber 30 or the caliber 50. Grander's choice. But generally speaking, people only ever went with the caliber 30 or 7.62. The French and the Swiss went differently. The Swiss put their 20 into the Panzer 61, and the French, of course, put the 20mm into the AMX-30. The AMX-30's cannon it was a coaxial, but it was independently elevated, so you could go much higher in elevation with the AMX-30's cannon, excuse me, than you could with the main gun. Very useful for shooting at buildings or helicopters, more to the point. But even then, the 12-7 is the coaxial machine gun on the Leclerc. And it's about the only gun, the only tank that has a large caliber coax today. And it's a matter of space, mainly. The 20mm cannon just takes up a lot of space that could be otherwise better used by other weapon systems inside a tank. And that includes the ammunition as well as the gun itself. A 7.62 takes up a lot less. Plus, a 7.62 is usually good enough for most things that don't require a 120. There are a few things perhaps the 12.7 might be better at, but generally speaking, the 7.62 is plenty good enough. And you carry a lot more ammunition of 7.62. And if you do have to have a caliber 50, such as you might put on a Japanese tank or an M1, something like that, there's nothing particularly wrong with putting it outside for the TC to play with. Now, back in the day, you had to choose which of the two guns you wanted your fire control system to use, unless you mounted the gun externally to the barrel, such as you might see maybe Israeli vehicles do, or the CSAM system for the M1 Abrams. But with the advent of remote weapon systems, you can now have stabilized ballistic computer accuracy on the external machine guns as well. So there's no longer even the argument for putting the 50 cal as the coaxial machine gun. So now I would strongly suspect that coaxials will never be more, in any other future tank, will never be more than the small arms equivalent, in this case is 7.62. The only reason I could possibly think of why you might do something different is if you're trying to lower the profile of the vehicle, because the 50 caliber remote weapon station is a little bit big. But again, that's space that's not inside the volume of the tank. So, Commissar Curl, I was about to go to bed and may as well ask my question. In World War II, there were plenty of vehicles that were so thin-skinned that it was feasible that most anti-tank weapons would zip right through and cause no damage unless they hit something like an engine or transmission. Yes. Recall reading that armor attacks by the Japanese were defeated by Shermans only when they switched from AP to HE, which was otherwise just over-penetrating. Did Ordnance or anybody else do testing of the effect of 75mm HE directly impacting on thin armor? Was there an armor thickness where HE shell would just shatter the armor or go straight through? So, were there any recommendations in manuals about armored vehicles that should be engaged with HE, such like Nashor and half-tracks or so on? Yes to both. If you look at the Armored Force Manual, for example, for the US Army, you will see that when engaging anything with a gun shield, such as, let's say, a PAC anti-tank gun, which had that sort of sloped gun shield, and if you look at that, it's actually a double layer gun shield as well. It's a bit of spaced armor. So it is actually quite effective armor as well against small arms. It recommends the use of HE delay, or at least HE base. And the reason being is that it has to get through that shield first before detonating. So they expect what you'll do is you'll shoot at the shield, go through the shield, and then detonate on the inside. I have no doubt that such things ended up being done for half-tracks as well, but I don't recall seeing that in the manual. Also, Ordnance did test the effect, the ballistic effect, of high explosive rounds against armor. So they will drag an M26 or M4 out there and they'll bombard it with, well, they wouldn't bombard it, what they actually do, they just set a HE charge next to the tank or HE shell next to the tank and detonate the shell. And they'll use anything up to 155 round HE to see what happens. So I don't know if they did anything directly for the offensive effect of HE rounds against enemy targets, but they certainly tested the effect of HE rounds against their own vehicles. So if they did more, I don't know. I don't recall it off the top of my head. Noob X N008X. Is there any specific reason why towed anti-tank guns fall out of favor in the aftermath of World War II? Have you seen the size of them? They're absolutely massive. Oh, going back also to the HE round against tanks. Remember when the 8.8 centimeter anti-tank gun, the Flak 18, anti-aircraft gun, was used in Spain against Russian tanks, T-26s and BTs? There was no AP round available at the time. The AP round was developed in 1938, I believe it was, as a bunker buster. Until then, they only had HE with contact fuses. But again, if you're firing an 8.8 at a BT-5 or a T-26, it doesn't really matter. So, anyway, towed anti-tank guns, they are bloody huge. That's why. They were fine when they were 25mm or 37mm. Even the 57 you can get away with. But when you're talking about 17-pounder and the 8.871, or whatever the hell the PAC-43 was, or the towed 90mm, these are guns that, if you're going to shoot, you better kill everything in the first 10 seconds because you can't run away. You can't drag them out. And there were plenty of incidences in World War II, places like Mortain or Anzio, where towed anti-tank units were simply overrun because they couldn't escape with their guns. It was a case of shoot and, oh dear, we haven't killed them all yet. So now that you have, the guns are really big, you have the infantry now have bazookas and RPGs and that sort of thing to provide a little bit of effective range more than a hand grenade or a rifle grenade. Or even recoilless rifles start coming along. The anti-tank gun just isn't really required. So if you look at what the anti-tank systems were in the 60s, for example, you're looking at a 106mm recoilless rifle for the Americans. You're looking at things like the Wombat for the British. I seem to recall there was also a higher level, sort of instead of Wombat was Weapon of Magnesium Battalion Anti-Tank, implying that there was either a company anti-tank or a regiment anti-tank. I'm not sure what. I need to look that up actually. But once you have those, they do more or less the same job as the anti-tank gun, so that was the end of it. Hugo U, was there a reason why some late war casemate TDs lacked cupolas, such as Jägerpanzer IV, Jägerpanther, and so on? I don't know, and it's a question I have been wondering about myself, because if you look at the prototype for Jägerpanzer IV, you'll see that the TC comes fairly well equipped with optics. Yet when you look at the production vehicle, it doesn't. And the other thing was when Panther got a optical sight for the bow gun that, you know, actually looks forward instead of the old letterbox that it had on the Panther D, because they put the optical sight there, they decided to delete the periscope that was facing face forward. So it almost makes you wonder if the Germans were running short on glass or something like that. Because I can't think of any other reason why they would have done that, because the Germans know about the advantages of cupolas. They tried them out, and I see no reason why they would have been deleted. And unfortunately, Panzertrax doesn't tell me why. Although now I think about it, maybe the medium Jägerpanzer book has it. Let's try this. This is Spielberger. Come on. Yes. So let me look for, hopefully the Jägerpanzer is in this. Jägerpanzer IV, page 99. So yeah, it was the initial mock-ups, as I recall, for Jägerpanzer IV had more optics. Okay, maybe it isn't in this one either. It could be in Panzertrax, which unfortunately it's one of these, and it takes me forever to find it. But I remember looking it up because I did the Inside the Hatch video on the Panzer IV, and it had optics. Josh Conti, I served on both the M2, M3 Bradley and the M1, correct, yes. What are the pros and cons of being assigned to both vehicles? Well, you get to sleep here and it's lovely and warm. Then again, in the Bradley, you drop the ramp, you put a block of wood underneath, and you sleep on that, and you're still dry, if not quite as warm. Would I change either one? The M1, I preferred the M1, I think. That's not to say I didn't like the Bradley. For a vehicle that has such a terrible reputation, I like it. And I think most Bradley crewmen actually do. The 25mm is absolutely fun to shoot. It's a hoot. It'll take your fingers off if you get it wrong, getting the damn thing in and out. But it is a fun gun. The 120 isn't so much fun as just awesome. Just sheer raw power. But the 25, you're tung, 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 tung. Yeah, having lots of fun. I found they rode more or less the same in terms of you're way high up and you're bouncing around a little bit over rough, uneven ground. The M1, you certainly got more legroom, even with the gunner in front of you. The loader could reach you could reach the T-maker without having to get down into the back of the track. Yes, the M1 now has a boiling vessel, and it's had one since the early 2000s. My M1A1 Ames had a boiling vessel down by the Lotus feed. The Bradley, you had to get, it was down by the back ramp. The Strikers have it by the back ramp as well, I do believe. So we're not too proud to steal a good idea. What would I change on any vehicle? I don't know if there's much I would change about the tank. I mean, it works fine. The Bradley obviously is well in need of upgunning, but that's in progress as it is. So, I don't know, I like both. Especially if you recall that my experience is many years old now, and there are updated versions of both. So even the A1 is now the Ames SA V2 or something like that, with better optics and God knows what else inside. And I had literally the oldest Bradley in the army. I did. So in 2010, 2009, my Bradley was still a pre-ODS, where you had to dial the range into the ballistic computer. All it did was adjusted the reticle a bit. And then when that got upgraded, it got upgraded to a plain Jane ODS. So they spent a week and a half teaching us how to operate this new vehicle, and really the only practical difference was you had a little extra button for your thumb for the laser rangefinder, but we had to go through the entire new equipment training. So these are tax dollars at work. Still, it was fun. It was a good excuse to go drive around and blow things up on the range. Gerald Hogue. If liquid propellant can be made to work reliably, would the size of ammunition be sufficiently changed to make the change to 130, 140, or 150 guns more reasonable? Yes, but why would you do it if the 120 can still do the job? Your rounds will be shorter, yes, but there'll still be, you're still adding 10, 20, or 35 millimeters to the diameter, which will reduce your overall capacity. So when it does go to liquid propellant, or if it goes to liquid propellant, yes, I could see an argument for doing a 130 millimeter round manually loaded with propellant being squirted in afterwards. Although I strongly suspect that what's really going to happen is that they'll just auto-load the whole damn thing anyway and get on with it. Adam Schindler, what was the relationship between the Irish and British armed forces during the Troubles? Cannot give an exhaustive history of the British occupation of Northern Ireland. Was this something I observed firsthand? Not really. It was coming to a close when I was in, and as a reservist, I didn't get involved with it anyway. Generally cordial. There would have been perhaps a little bit of time in the what's it, Lynch? Jack Lynch was the Taoiseach, Prime Minister, when there was talk about invading the north. Obviously, it's a story that has grown in the retelling. But generally speaking, both sides were fighting the same fight against the same opposition. I never heard much good said about the IRA when I was in the Irish military. Or I should say the provisional IRA, because the actual IRA ended up being in the Irish military. There was an incident in the mid-70s, 1976, up near Dundalk? A British SAS unit was on the wrong side of the border, some say by accident, some say deliberately. I think the jury right now says deliberately. And for whatever reason, they failed to report in, or they sent somebody to go get them. And these guys drove across the border, one of whom was Fijian, so it didn't look very local. Drove across the border in an unmarked car, armed, wearing civilian attire, and they come across a police checkpoint. And again, the Gardaí aren't armed, so they feel under no particular compunction to be cooperative, and the Gardaí are there. It's kind of like, where are you coming from? Where are you going to? And the answers were not what really satisfied the Gardaí, the police. So they said, all right, lads, get out of the car, because they also saw, they didn't make mention of it, but they saw one of the guns sort of half badly hidden. I said, right, lads, out of the car. And they said, no. I said, right, lads, out of the car. Until finally the army shows up. They step out from behind the hedge. Now, if you don't know how an Irish vehicle checkpoint works, and I say Irish as in Northern Ireland as well, it is not the same as an American VCP. It's very low key. And I've been on the receiving end of them as well. So you drive in along, you go around the corner, and all of a sudden somebody steps out from behind a bush. Stop. And it may be a Garda, I mean, he may be armed, he may be unarmed, whatever. So he stops and has a chat with you. And he's actually called the chatter. And what he'll do is he'll ask you, just engage in very, very brief conversation, like 60 seconds of conversation, just to see if there's any little alarm bells go off. And you got to have a fairly switched on man to be the chatter. And what you can't see are the rest of the squad with the machine guns and all that, which are well hidden now from the background. And maybe there's a vehicle around the corner that can come out to cut the lane should you decide to bugger off. And after the first 60 seconds or so, the chat, or maybe 2 minutes, and he might even ask you, what's simple stuff like what's the license plate on your vehicle, or can you turn on the wipers, just to make sure it's actually your car. But if after 60 seconds he doesn't get the alarm bells going off for 2 minutes, it's right, lads, off you go, you're good. And if a couple of alarm bells do go off, he'll ask you to pull off to the side of the road and you'll have a more stringent talk, and maybe they'll even disassemble your car at the side of the road. But it's all very low-key and generally speaking pleasant, such a thing. Whereas an American VCP, the way they teach you is basically everybody gets out of the car and the car gets strip searched down, and it'll take you 5 minutes to do one vehicle, and God help the traffic, but hey, we don't care, we're the American Army. We tried teaching that to some of our lads. Didn't necessarily take. Apparently there was some force protection issue about having one guy just stand up while the guy was still inside the car. So it's one of those things of how much are you going to piss off the population when you try to do your job. Anyway, I digress. So this guy they're convinced to get out of the vehicle, and they are arrested by the Gardaí for unlawful possession of a weapon. So on. So they get arrested and sent back to the station. So once they get dropped off at the station, the Gardaí go back to their checkpoint, and a while later they come across another couple of vehicles coming to their checkpoint looking for the previous guys. Same thing, they end up getting arrested and brought back. And so we now have, I think it's like 8 members of the SAS are sitting in an Irish prison in Dundalk, I think it was. A little international incident going on there, and the British aren't happy. It's, look, we're all after the same guys, and the Gardaí go, well, yeah, we are, but you're on the wrong side of the border. Now the border is not marked. It's like a state line in the US. Unless you actually know that you're crossing in from Texas to Oklahoma, there's no border fence or anything. And it could be that the road itself is the border. So a patrol walk on one side can be Irish Army, and in Ireland. A patrol walk on the other side could be British Army in the UK. But no dice. In order to settle it, what they ended up doing is technically the charges were imprisonment of the unlicensed possession of a weapon and God knows what else. They could have been facing 20 years in an Irish jail. Obviously that wasn't going to happen. I'm not sure I would give very much for the life expectancy even of an SAS man in an Irish jail in the 1970s. So they ended up, as I recall, they stood trial, were fined $100 or £100, and then ejected from the country. I think that was it. They stood for trial. They were found guilty. They paid the fine. The weapons were returned. They were investigated to make sure they hadn't been used in any other killings in the Republic, and that was that. That was the most famous incident, but there were other incidents of usually the British crossing onto the wrong side, because the British Army would rotate troops in and out, whereas the Irish obviously, they pretty much just lived there. Of lieutenants getting lost and crossing onto the wrong side of the border by accident, and then all being very embarrassed and going back, or things like that. Covert missions to rescue soldiers that accidentally got caught on the wrong side of the border. No engagements, just, yeah, Corporal, I think I'm in the Republic. I'm in front of this pub here. Can you come and get me? What is my take on the upcoming Leopard 2 A7V from Alexander H? I haven't been in one. I don't really have a take. New optics, fantastic. I think the two biggest lethality improvements are going to be the new optics and the programmable fuse high explosive ammunition. So it'll do air burst, it'll do timed explosion, it'll do delay burst. It's basically the German version of what the Americans are trying to do with the AMP round. Now, what the AMP round does that the DM11 doesn't, I don't know why we're spending this extra money. And the Israelis have a similar round as well, the APAM round, I think it's called. However, we are making our own, and the A7V also is supposed to be dual mode. You can configure it for, and I love this, the KMW press release says dual configuration. A duel is in D-U-E-L, tanko a tanko. And the alternate configuration is counterinsurgency, which is less armor up front and more armor around the side. So obviously they realize that there's a limit. It's only 60 tons. It still has the same 1500 horsepower MTU engine. I mean, it's an evolutionary upgrade. I don't think there's anything particularly dramatic about it, other than the programmable ammunition, which now should be a default for any new tank or any new weapon system that comes out. It should have programmable high explosive. Loch Ness hamster. Where's Nessie? This is Nessie, by the way. And you can see that Nessie has jump wings because I did all 5 jumps with Nessie in my pocket, and I had her. She had a logbook that got stamped after every jump. So she is actually a jump qualified Loch Ness monster. Picked her up and drummed a rocket. Rather than upgrading to a 130, 140, would NATO tanks up the velocity of the 120? What are the limiting factors on the velocity of a projectile? It's basic physics. There's only so much pressure that the gun can take, and if that has been maximized, the only way of increasing the velocity is to decrease the mass of the projectile. And right now, if you look at a cutaway saber round, they are pretty damn small. They're very thin and they're very dense. So as long as the ammunition is capable of achieving the requirements, which in the case of the American 120 with this DU ammunition is the L44, and the case of other tanks that don't use DU ammunition for whatever bizarre reason, it's kind of like, oh, it's inhumane to use depleted uranium as you shred the insides of the enemy tank and murder everybody inside. Sometimes you wonder about people. War, I can go off on a tangent about the moral philosophies of war. It's kind of like, if you keep making it more and more humane, then it becomes a more and more viable way of settling the world's problems. If I'm inside the T-72, I don't think it really matters to me if I got hit by tungsten or DU. Anyway, digression. I should say, just to be clear, I'm saying this in my own personal opinion capacity, not as a representative of the United States military or anything else. George Paramore, when did heat become truly effective as a tank shell to the point of replacing AP? It never did, really. If you look at the ammunition supply of tanks from the heat era, which is really the 60s and 70s, there was always AP rounds. There was always Fin or APDS. Heat did become it did become a round of preference for medium range, because you did have that effect that was always going to be the same regardless of the distance. And obviously for lower velocity cannons, it would be the default. So things like the AML-90, the medium velocity guns. But did it ever replace AP? Maybe older folks can chime in on this one. Oh, speaking of chiming in, this is the downside, by the way, of not using the teleprompter and the script. Is I do my typical Irish thing and I go off on tangents. There were quite a few responses in the last Q&A as to why tanks don't use boxer engines. So if you are waiting for the answer on that, go back to the previous video and check out the text commentary. But I mean, heat was always viable, and of course the British always loved HESH anyway, but I don't think it ever replaced AP. Is there any penetrator that's better than DU but not used due to supply or cost reasons? Probably. I don't know what it is because it's not used. Generally speaking, the only tungsten is the default. Now, what tungsten doesn't do is it doesn't have a sort of a self-sharpening effect that DU does. And there have been attempts to create a tungsten alloy. I mean, in theory, tungsten should be better because, as I recall correctly, it is actually more dense than DU. But the effect when it actually impacts the metal is not as good. So as I understand, there are attempts to try to create a tungsten-based alloy which has DU properties whilst being tungsten and heavier and also more politically acceptable. But it hasn't happened yet. Jesus, George, how many questions are you asking me? Has any AFV I know of personally been saved by ARA? No, the only AFV I've seen personally got hit by a shaped charge was hit by an RPG. It impacted on the left side number 7 skirt, as I recall, detonated, went through the hull, and the shock, of all things, knocked out the engine. When the firefight was over, it started up the engine and went home. But other than that, no. There are photographs, obviously, also of the cage armor defusing RPG-7s. And that's what cage armor does. It doesn't pre-detonate normally. It's designed to defuse RPG-7s. If it's not an RPG-7, that's another matter entirely. But since most things are RPG-7... Okay, USA. What and when did the Western Allies know about the T-34? Did the Soviets give or sell a copy to the West for trials? And it is USA. Okay. Yes, they did. The T-34, which is in Fort Lee, it was a donated vehicle given by the Soviets for the Americans to basically poke around in, and the British similarly. They got a T-34 76 for the same reason. And they tried them out. The reports for both are generally available online. At least the Soviet report on the American report is available online for the American one, and somewhere I've seen British assessment as well. And by the time it got there, I mean, they weren't the latest and greatest, but they were still relatively early on, obviously being a 76 model. And after the Korean War, of course, the Americans got plenty of 3485s as well to play with. Opinions, like anything else, they've got a few good points, they've got a few bad points. The American negative side is often a little bit perhaps overstated. They didn't like it very much, but they did appreciate some of the factors. The British similarly is overstated. The British, oh, we should build a T-34 here in British factories. No, you shouldn't. It's like one or two lines that get emphasized in third-party reporting. Okay, I am calling a break here because, again, like in the reading of the book of armaments, this went on way the hell longer than I thought it would. Actually, it's about 2 hours, so I'm splitting this up into 2, which is good because it means that actually I might be able to finish editing the video that I'm filming right now when you're watching this by the time part 2 of this is done. So, or maybe I'll release this on Wednesday. I haven't decided yet. We'll see. Anyway, I'll see you in a couple of days for the next one. Take care.